Hello! So in this video I'm going to have a look at the graphics settings in Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 1, but specifically using the Battlefield 4 settings in Battlefield 1. Now to do this I've removed the profiles. So that's the file that you can actually have in the Battlefield directory that locks some things down. I'm only going to be using the graphics settings. As you can see, I've turned the FPS counter on. It's in the top right, but I've made it larger in the bottom left. So these starting settings are just Battlefield 4 on Ultra, and I've picked Operation Outbreak because it was the last map that was designed for Battlefield 4 and is technically the most detailed map that they made. In fact, they had to pull back the detail to make this map run on the consoles. Now I'm recording this footage in shadow play because that has the least effect on the actual in-game graphics and the frame rate that you get. And as you can see, running down the track on Operation Outbreak, I'm getting about 100 frames per second. In fact, as I go towards the buildings, the frame rate goes up. Now the buildings and the dirt obviously have less textures in them than the bushes and the trees. So that's, I think, why the frame rate goes up here. So here we're hitting about 120 frames per second. It goes down to about 110 and it goes up to about 125. So in this area, Ultra settings works fine. Fortunately, it doesn't reach 144, which my new monitor is. But here you can see inside this built-up area, it does actually fluctuate a lot more, but it goes a lot higher. Now, I'm not quite sure why this is. It drops back down to 100 again, but in certain areas it will spike up quite a bit higher than that. So Battlefield 4 on a 6700K and a 980 Ti runs pretty well on Ultra settings. It's not pushing the 144Hz on Ultra, but it worked fine when I had a 120Hz monitor. Now I've got 144Hz monitor. Well, I'd probably push the settings a bit, and that's what we're going to do next. Tweak the settings to get the frame rate higher. So this is the same round on the same server, same map, same everything. And I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to change them over to the settings I've used in Battlefield 4 pretty much since launch. They're based on some settings that X Factor released about 3 or 4 years ago, I think. Can't remember how long ago it was. I think it might have even been for the beta. Now these do use the profile, but as I've said, I've deleted that, so all I'm going to be testing Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 1 on is the in-game settings and increasing the FPS that way. And the reason I'm doing it in Battlefield 4 first is because I know these settings work in Battlefield 4, and I'm going to show you how much they work in Battlefield 4, and then you can compare it to Battlefield 1 later when I do the same settings changes in that. So, as you can see, there's a lot more difference in the frame rate. The frame rate goes up and down a lot more, but it's consistently higher. Now, if you've got a G-Sync monitor, this frame rate going up and down isn't really going to matter. As you can see, running through the undergrowth, I'm basically getting around 200 frames per second. If you do change the graphics settings, it does take a while in Battlefield 4 to settle down. Now as you can see, it's now dropping to like 150, 160 frames per second, but then we'll go back up to 200. So the changes are a lot more obvious, but the actual frame rate is a lot higher. And that's because at times it's having to do a lot less texture work than it was before, so it leaps up in frame rate and then it comes back to doing pretty much the same amount of texture work that it was doing before, so the frame rate drops again. But yeah, 200 frames per second when running with the optimal settings for Battlefield 4. So let's see what those settings do when we move across to Battlefield 1. So here we are in Battlefield 1 and I've picked the map that's closest to Operation Outbreak. Again, we're running on Ultra settings, and again you've got the frame rate blown up in the bottom left hand corner. And as you can see, I'm getting about 100 frames per second running through the forest, the same as I was getting in Battlefield 4. If you do want to look at your frame rate in Battlefield 1, it works slightly different than it does in Battlefield 4. So you can still go into the console and use the perf overlay.draw FPS 1 command, but every time you respawn, you have to redo that command. It doesn't last forever like it did in Battlefield 4. But as you can see, the frame rate is really stable. It climbs a bit, but it's sitting around 100 frames per second as I'm running through this area. When I go inside, it does go up, but not as much as it did in Battlefield 4. The frame rate seems to be really stuck down well in Battlefield 1. Whether you're running through the wooded areas or whether you're running through the buildings and the trenches, doesn't seem to have a lot more effect on the frame rate. Now I'm guessing that means overall the textures are a lot more detailed in Battlefield 1 than they were in Battlefield 4, and that makes sense. Even using the scope, the frame rate doesn't really change that much, and when you get into combat and you've got flames and gas going off as we're about to have here, again the frame rate is really stable. It's not leaping up and down, it's staying around that 100 frames per second, and the engine seems to be really well optimized. It's not running faster than Battlefield 4, but it's not running slower, and it seems to be a lot more stable. But what do you do if you want to get that frame rate higher? Well, all I'm doing is going into Battlefield 1, into the video settings, into advanced, and changing these over to exactly the same as they were in Battlefield 4. So setting the graphics quality to custom, then going through the settings, most of which are labelled the same. You've got undergrowth quality, which I'm setting to high, but the biggest change is going to be anti-aliasing post, which on Battlefield 4 lets you set it to low. But in Battlefield 1, the lowest setting is either off or medium. So I've set it to medium, because that seems to be the closest thing to Battlefield 4. Battlefield 4 had anti-aliasing post on, it was just at a lower range. My resolution scale is 120%, and I'm going to turn weapon DOF off because it was turned off in Battlefield 4. So now let's have a look at the frame rate. So the first thing I need to do is go in and draw the frame rate on again, because like I say, it removes itself every time you die. But as you can see, instantly the frame rate is 50 frames per second higher. So running through these woods, I was getting 100 frames per second. I'm now getting 150 frames per second. So you can see the difference isn't quite as immense as it was in Battlefield 4, but it's also a lot more stable than it was in Battlefield 4. Yeah, it's going down into the 140s, but it's nowhere near as jumpy as it was in Battlefield 4 either. Now, I do have a G-Sync monitor. In fact, I have two G-Sync monitors now. So having a variable frame rate isn't as big a deal as it was, but keeping a consistent frame rate is still a very advisable thing. Now, true, I'm not constantly over the 144 frames per second that my 144 Hz monitors would like, but I'm pretty damn close to it. Okay, there's a lot of effects going off now, and it drops down into the 120s, but I think this is a pretty damn good frame rate, considering I'm running a 980 Ti, which is the last generation of graphics card. It's still a very good graphics card, but it's not a 1070 or a 1080. So it looks like Battlefield 4's settings do work in Battlefield 1. I'm getting a 50% boost in frame rate, and the graphics are still pretty much identical. In fact, you're often getting some advantages from lowering your graphics settings to reduce some of the explosion effects that obscure enemy players. So if you want to give these graphics settings a try, here they are. Texture quality is high, texture filtering is high, lighting quality is low, effects quality is low, post-processing quality is medium, mesh quality is high, terrain quality is high, undergrowth quality is high, anti-aliasing post is FXAA medium, and ambient occlusion is off. And I have resolution scale set to 120%. So give those a try. It'd be interesting to know if you get a similar frame rate boost to what I did, and let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.